We are about to talk to a former Secret Service agent with a secret that, if true, could rewrite so much of what we know happened on the day President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. It is a confession he says he is making after 60 years of silence, all about a single bullet he found in the back of that convertible. Now, the implications could be staggering. There's a lot of fact from fiction that we're going to be separating here, so we want to start with just a little bit of history and take you back to that fateful day in Dallas in 1963.
The motorcade is traveling at about 20 to 25 miles an hour. This is the scene of confusion. Something has happened here. The cameraman running toward the scene to the presidential car ahead of him. These films from outside the emergency room of Parkland Hospital in Dallas as the president is dying inside. Senator Ralph Yarborough, who saw the shooting, said he heard shots and then saw a Secret Service man pound his fist against a rear fender of the presidential car in anguish.
White House Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff has just announced that President Kennedy died at approximately 1 o'clock Central Standard Time, which is about 35 minutes ago.
After being shot at.
After being shot.
By an unknown assailant.
By an unknown assailant.
During a motorcade drive through downtown Dallas.
During a motorcade drive through downtown Dallas.
A flash from Dallas. Two priests who were with President Kennedy say he is dead of bullet wounds. This is the latest information we have from Dallas. Of course, standing by to give you all available information as it comes to us. I will repeat with the greatest...
And the remains of John F. Kennedy are about to pass a memorial to another president assassinated.
Now, the final report by the Warren Commission concluded that 3 shots were fired. 1 shot passed through the president's back and exited through his neck. It may have also hit Texas Governor John Connally, seeming to ricochet inside his body, and that the last shot hit President Kennedy in the head. But here's the thing. The root of most conspiracies surrounding what happened deal with a mystery known as the magic bullet theory, all having to do with the shot that entered JFK's back, as doctors told Congress, and then again somehow allegedly exited through his neck, then pierced the governor. Sitting there in front of him, went through the governor's chest, shattering a rib, then exiting his body, then going back inside to his wrist, went through that, and then hit his leg. And that bullet was found intact at the hospital. Now, it was always assumed that it fell off the governor's stretcher, but today, that Secret Service agent who we are about to talk to says he's the one who found that bullet and put it on the stretcher. But before we get to him, let's take a quick look at this report from NBC's Liz Kurtz.
60 years after one of the most earth-shattering days in modern American history, when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas in 1963.
President John F. Kennedy died at approximately 1 o'clock Central Standard Time.
Former Secret Service agent Paul Landis, who was with the president that day, is opening up for the first time about what he witnessed. For decades, the prevailing theory was that one bullet struck JFK and then hit Texas Governor John Connally, who was sitting in front of him. It became known as the magic bullet theory, which explained how one shooter could have fired all the shots. The theory is based on this bullet being found on Governor Connally's gurney at the hospital. But now in a new book, Landis says he knows how it got there. The 88-year-old tells the New York Times he found that bullet lodged in the car seat behind where Kennedy was killed. He says he then took that bullet to the hospital and placed it on the president's gurney. It was a piece of evidence, he tells the Times, and I didn't want it to disappear or get lost. So it was, Paul, you've got to make a decision, and I grabbed it. But Landis now says he thinks the bullet may have rolled from Kennedy's gurney to Connally's, meaning it may not have been the bullet that injured Connally.
Dr. Aguilar, you studied this case for years. How significant is this?
I think this is a significant piece of new evidence to support the idea that there was more than one gunman in Dealey Plaza.
Clint Hill, the Secret Service agent who climbed on the back of the limo after Kennedy was shot, questions Landis' story.
Why do you have doubts about his account?
Because if you check all the evidence, statements, things that happened, they don't line up. It doesn't make any sense to me that he's trying to put it on the president's journey.
But Landis, who is not available for an interview with NBC News, tells the Times he made mistakes in his initial reports. He says he's been afraid to share his true story until now.
Liz Kreutz, NBC News.
Thanks so much, Liz. Paul Landis, a witness to the assassination and author of the book The Final Witness, joins us now. And James Robinault, a presidential historian who wrote the profile in Vanity Fair on Paul's book, joins us as well. First off, Mr. Landis, thank you so much for joining us. I can't imagine the trauma of seeing what you saw and then having to relive it for decades. Thank you so much for speaking to us tonight. I know this is decades and decades in the past, but what do you remember starting with the first shot all the way to discovering the bullet?
Well, I remember the first shot came from over my right shoulder. I turned around to look to see where it was coming from. I scanned quickly the grassy knoll area that was in front of us or to our right. I looked at President Kennedy. I did not realize he'd been hit at that moment. He was raising his arms, and I thought and leaning to the left, I thought he was turning to see where the sound came from. Just after that, I scanned quickly to the right, back again. I was looking at the president when the second sound happened. I still did not see any reaction from anybody in the presidential limo. And at that point, we were approaching the underpass, and I heard a loud report that came very shortly after the second one. We flew through the underpass. During this whole time, the 6 seconds that took place, I saw Clint Hill running to the president's limo and reaching to get up on the trunk. He got up there just as Mrs. Kennedy seemed to be reaching out up over the trunk and getting back. And Clint pushed her back into the seat, covered the body, and we flew under the underpass. And I had no idea where we were going. I assumed it was closest hospital available. We arrived at Parkland Memorial Hospital. I jumped out of the follow-up car and raced up to Mrs. Kennedy in the limo. I reached over and took her by the shoulders and asked her if I could help her. She said, no, I want to stay with him. I want to stay with the president. About that time, Clint entered the rear of the car, and I realized that Mrs. Kennedy was hiding the president's head and didn't want anybody to see the head wound. So he immediately convinced her. He took off his suit coat, covered her head, his president's head, and they started to get up to leave the limousine. In the meantime, while this was happening, I happened to look to the right where Mrs. Kennedy was sitting, and sitting in a pool of blood there, I saw 2 bright brass bullet fragments. I picked one of them up, looked at it, and it was kind of like the end of my little pinky. It was mushroomed, and I put it back right exactly where I found it. And by then, Mrs. Kennedy was standing up, and I was looking around for other agents. I didn't see anybody, but I saw an intact, fully bullet on the back of the seat where the cushioning met the trunk of the car. And I picked it up and looked at it, and it was, only thing I noticed that was wrong with it were bullet striations. There was no other deformities. I started to put it back. Mrs. Kennedy and Clint were leaving the car, and I made a quick decision. I didn't see anybody to secure the car. People were emerging on the car. I did not want this piece of evidence to disappear, and I slipped it into my pocket. We raced through the lobby of the emergency room. On the way out of the car, I noticed Mrs. Kennedy's pillbox hat, her clutch purse, and I picked them up. And then I noticed there was a Zippo cigarette lighter on the seat. It was all covered with blood. And I turned it over and it had the presidential seal on it. I thought it was Mrs. Kennedy's, or came out of her purse. Didn't think anything else of it, but I figured that Mrs. Kennedy didn't need to see this. So I slipped that in my pocket too, and figured I would give it to Provey, her personal maid, when we got back to the White House. As we raced through the lobby of the emergency room, we got to trauma room 1. They had to pivot the gurney that the president's body was on and push it into the trauma room. There was a crowd that kind of had joined us doing this. I was pushed right up next to the president's body and standing right next to his feet. Most everybody in the room was focused on the head wound. I could not look. I knew I would pass out if I saw it. But all these things are whirling through my mind on what to do. And I realized this was a perfect place to leave a bullet with the president's body, and it would be found during the autopsy. And about that time, so I reached out, I put the bullet on the gurney right by his feet. And about that time, everybody, the doctors were asking everybody to leave. Somebody came in and said, please, please let me through. I'm a doctor. And somebody else, another doctor, they asked everybody to leave, give them room to work. So we turned and kind of joined the crowd going out of the trauma room. Mrs. Kennedy had come in and she kind of slipped to the left of the door entrance. So I kind of stood there with her while everybody was leaving. And then I followed her out when she stepped out. I spotted Clint and Roy Kellerman in an office to the left. And I walked over to tell Clint I was going to be over with Mrs. Kennedy. And he, at that point, he was on a phone. What else from there?
Paul, sorry, real fast, Paul. When you found that bullet, this bullet has become the focal point of so much history. When you found that bullet, was it lodged in a cushion? You said that it had striations. Was it lodged in the cushion? Was it just sitting on the back of the seat next to where the convertible came down? How would you describe its condition when you found it?
It was perfect condition. It was not buried or sunken in a seam. It was just lying where the seam on the back of the seat meets the middle of the trunk. And it's where they would have attached the bubble top if they had or were putting it on.
And you got a good look at it. Did it have any blood or any sort of matter on it?
I didn't notice any blood. It was like everybody wrote or says, it was a pristine bullet. The only thing on it were rifle striations. And that's all I noticed at the time. And this was all.
Paul, do you think?
No, I'm sorry.
Sorry. Do you think that the bullet that you found at the back of the car, do you think that that one was possibly the one that hit President Kennedy in the back and then may have fallen back out in the second shot? Or do you think that that might have been the shot that missed? I know you described only hearing 2 gunshots. What are your thoughts?
I did hear 3 gunshots.
You heard 3 gunshots. So do you think that it was the one that went in his back, or do you think that this might have, I don't know, been the other one that was never found?
I didn't have any thoughts at that time. All I saw was a bullet that was there, and I wanted to preserve it to make sure that it didn't get lost. That's basically it.
And we've heard from Clint Hill, the other Secret Service agent there. He questions your account, saying it doesn't make any sense to him. What do you make of that?
I really don't know. That's Clint's theory. That's his thought. We never talked to each other after the assassination about the events. We worked together for the next 7 months. I really can't answer what his thinking is or why.
So many people that are watching this are going to wonder, why come forward now? Why not say something earlier?
Well, nobody asked me, and I never thought about it. I didn't read anything about the assassination. I had nightmares. I buried everything. I refused to read anything about it because I figured I'd been there, I'd witnessed it, I didn't need to read anything. All the assassination theories and things that were out there, I never took a look at. There was only one book, and it was just coincidentally happened in 2014. And I'm doing volunteer work for the Shaker Heights Police Department, and the chief of the police there came to the auction. We were doing a property auction. Police chief came, said, "Paul, I have a book that I think you'd be interested in." And he gave me this book, and it was called 6 Seconds in Dallas. I took it home thinking I'd read it immediately, but I just put it on a nightstand, and it was 3 months before I decided it was time to start reading about what was going on. I don't know.
And Paul, when you started to realize that they were calling the bullet that you found the magic bullet, and this whole theory revolved around this one magic bullet, knowing what you knew at the time, what went through your mind?
This was wrong. They were attributing that bullet to being on Governor Connolly's stretcher, and I knew I'd picked it up and carried it in and put it on President Kennedy's stretcher, and that's really the only thing that had me concerned. I didn't know what to do about that at the time.
The way I understand it, you set out, just like all of us journalists, with a healthy dose of skepticism. You met Paul, you started asking questions, and the way I understand it, you were struck with his story, with his candor, and the next thing you know, you're acting almost as his confidant before the release of his book here. What strikes you about his story?
Well, first of all, the book was done when I read it. He had completed the book. And at the very end of the book, I was like, okay, so what does this mean? Because he does not speculate about anything. He just says what he knows and what he saw and what he found. And so I called the publisher who had published my last 2 books, coincidentally. That's why they sent me the book to do a blurb of this book. And I said, this guy is going to have a lot of people coming at him, asking a lot of questions. I think he's going to need somebody to spend some time with him before we launch. And so Paul and I have met maybe about 15 times, usually 2 hours at a time. And we've gone over everything. I put him through the paces. Why did you wait? Is this possible? That sort of thing. And over time, I became convinced that it was not only possible, but that it was very probable that this bullet that he's talking about stuck in Kennedy's back and then fell out the back. The night of the autopsy, those autopsy doctors could only get their little pinkies just a short bit into the back wound. There was no outlet, and they were perplexed by it. So that all changed, and that's a different story. But once I started looking at all this, having been someone who believed in the Warren Commission, I now thought, well, wait a minute, if this bullet stuck in his back, then it is not the single bullet that went through and then hit Conley and caused all that injury. And it only makes sense because the one that caused Conley's injury broke major bones, and it would not have been not severely deformed if not broken into pieces. So over time, I became convinced that this story was true, correct, and I tried to put it all together in that Vanity Fair article that I did.
It's a great article. And Paul, I've got to ask you the same question that Jim has probably asked over and over and over again. Do you think that Lee Harvey Oswald was the only person involved? Do you think he was the gunman, the sole gunman in the assassination of John F. Kennedy?
I think the fact that they found three, what I based my decision on was the fact they found 3 cartridge cases in the school book depository. And I think it had to be one person. And I feel comfortable at this point that that's who it was, and he was the lone assassin.
Paul Landis, Jim, thank you so much for joining us. A lot to process there. Really looking forward to reading more on your account.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's too soon to tell how that's going to change theories surrounding such an important moment in our nation's history. But a quick note before we move on, it is not lost on me that this is a chapter of our past that a lot of people would like to learn from and move on. But I got to say, we live in a day and age of rampant conspiracies. And as a journalist, I've always thought that questioning what happens is not something that ends. It's something that we continue to do when the story evolves. I know I look young, but in my 19 years of covering the news, I can't tell you how many times I've seen a story change again and again and again. And I've found that accounts that insist that 100% certainty this is what happened can often be as unreliable as those who say, look, there is something that doesn't add up, must be some sort of secret conspiracy. So I guess the bottom line here is that we always deserve more information, just as much as we deserve to keep an open mind.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.
Let's bring in author James Robinault, who penned a Vanity Fair article, spoke with Landis. Thank you so much for being with us. I had a chance to read your article. How significant is this new account if it is, in fact, true?
Well, it is the biggest news since 1964 when the Warren Commission issued its report. This is brand new information. It was never shared until now. And Paul Landis, who's the Secret Service agent we're talking about, Jackie Kennedy's Secret Service agent, was there that day. He was in the follow-on car called Halfback, and he saw the president's head explode. You can see him in the film and in all the photographs in the car right behind the limousine. They then sped to Parkland Hospital with the president, mortally wounded. And when they got there, Paul jumped out of Halfback and with fellow agent Clint Hill tried to get Mrs. Kennedy to let go of the president, who she cradled in her lap. She would not do so for quite a while. Finally, Clint took his coat off and put it over the president's head, and she agreed to get up. When she stood up, he saw 2 bullet fragments on the actual seat itself, and then up on the ledge, right behind where Kennedy's back would have hit the ledge when he was hit with the final shot, was this intact, pristine bullet that he picked up and took with him into the hospital. Once he was in the hospital, he left it on Kennedy's stretcher. He and Mrs. Kennedy were in Trauma Room 1 for about a minute, and he left it on the stretcher knowing Kennedy was mortally wounded and dead and wanted the bullet to be with his body at the time of the autopsy. So it's hugely significant because it completely undercuts the Warren Commission's single bullet theory.
It truly does, James. I mean, at the heart of this account, this largely intact bullet, how did it wind up on the ledge of that back seat?
Yeah, I mean, as I wrote in Vanity Fair, we're never going to know for sure, but what seems to have happened is Kennedy was shot right back here in his upper shoulder, not in his neck, as the Warren Commission said, but upper shoulder. And it appears the bullet was undercharged, which happened with these World War II vintage bullets that were being used. So it was sticking out of his back. The final shot pushes him back violently against the chair that he's sitting in, the back seat. And it either dislodged at that point on its own, or you can see in this film you're showing, the Zapruder film, Mrs. Kennedy has her arms around him and literally brushes the area where that bullet would have been sticking out. And it may have gotten put into her clothing, because as you know, she then turned and tried to grab a piece of his skull that had been blasted onto the back of the car, and she stretches way out over before Clint Hill saves her and puts her back in. Right where she stretched over, if it was in her clothing, is where Paul found the bullet. So one of those two ways, I think, is how it got there.
I mean, James, this is so fascinating. All of these decades later, you know, Americans, you know, people around the world, I think, are so fascinated about this. But let's talk about motivation. Why do you think Paul Landis is choosing to come forward at this point? He is 88 years old. I know you said he's very physically active. He certainly has his wits about him. But how confident should we feel about his ability to remember after so much time? I mean, it's hard for all of us. It can be hard to remember what we did last week.
I know. You know, I was very skeptical when I read the book, and I've spent about 15 sessions with him working through all of this. And I can tell you his memory is better than mine. I wish I had as good a memory as he does. But, you know, if you say to anybody my age or older, where were you on the day Kennedy was assassinated, they know exactly where they were and who they were with and what happened. It's an indelible memory. Same with 9/11 today. You ask people of the younger generation, where were they on 9/11? They all remember that. Do you remember the day before? No. Do you remember the day after? No. But that day you do remember. So it's a very indelible memory for him. And, you know, he's coming forward now because 10 years ago, he read a book for the first time about the assassination and saw that they had this central fact wrong, that they said they found the bullet on Governor Conley's stretcher. And Paul was like, no, I brought that bullet in and left it on JFK's stretcher. So they had this fundamental fact wrong, and he began to ask people about it and then decided to write his book. But it's taken a period of time because he's not a writer. You know, He had to get this all together.
So, you know, this calls into question, again, the whole lone gunman theory. Do you think Lee Harvey Oswald did act alone, especially if this information from Landis is true?
But here's the problem. If it stuck in Kennedy's back and did not transit and then hit Governor Conley, you can see on the Zapruder film that Kennedy is reacting to being shot as he comes out from behind that sign, and a second later Conley reacts. It is not enough time for Lee Harvey Oswald to do his bold action, which takes at least 2.3 seconds to, you know, turn it and aim and fire. So a second is too soon. It means Oswald couldn't have hit Kennedy with the first bullet and then Conley with the second bullet. So if that's true and it really did stick in his back and there was a second bullet, it really raises exponentially the possibility that there was a second shooter. And if that's true, there may have been multiple shooters. So it really changes everything.
Well, thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find News Nation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of News Nation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.